I shouldn't be alive to tell you this, but here I am, whispering into the dark about a place that eats at the edges of your sanity. The Lost Creek Cottage in Oklahoma is no ordinary home. It sits crooked in a clearing where the woods grow, too thick, where the ground feels soft as if something beneath is breathing. The first time I unlocked its door, I saw a woman's reflection in the hallway mirror, though the glass was cracked and the hall behind me was empty. They told me there are rules you must follow if you want to make it through the night, but no one ever explained why. Now I know. Now I wish I had run. If you hear scratching at the windows after midnight, don't look. Don't even breathe too loudly, because the moment you acknowledge it, it acknowledges you back. Pause. And that's how I learned that the cottage doesn't just keep secrets. It collects them. I never wanted this job. Not really. But desperation makes a man do things he swears he never would. And by the time I got the offer to be the caretaker of the Lost Creek Cottage, I had already been living out of my car for 3 weeks, counting coins for gas, and ignoring the growing stench of old fast food wrappers stuffed in the back seat. The ad in the classifieds was simple, almost too simple. Caretaker needed for rural property. Room and board provided. Must be willing to work nights. Good pay. That was it. No phone number, just a P.O. box in Tulsa, and the strangest part was that when I sent my letter of interest, I got a reply within 48 hours. Handwritten on thick yellow paper that smelled faintly of smoke, inviting me to an interview in a diner off Route 64. The man who met me there was tall, gaunt, with pale skin that looked like it had never seen the sun, and he had this way of speaking without ever really moving his lips, like ventriloquism, like the words were being pushed out against their will. He told me the cottage was old, built before statehood, and all I'd need to do was keep it clean, keep it safe, and stay overnight. He never said what I'd be keeping it safe from, and I didn't ask, not until later when questions had already started boiling in my gut, questions that had no good answers. When I first laid eyes on the cottage, it was late evening, the sun bleeding orange over the tree line, and the house itself stood like it was leaning into the woods, its shingles blackened from years of rain and moss, its windows narrow and crooked, its front porch sagging under its own weight. The air smelled of damp pine needles and something else, something faintly metallic, like rust or dried blood, and I tried to convince myself it was just my nerves playing tricks. The man handed me the keys, a ring of old iron things that clinked heavy in my palm, and told me I'd be alone, but if I listened carefully, I'd always know when I wasn't. He didn't explain that either, just drove off in his dusty truck, and left me staring at the door that seemed to breathe with the wind. Inside, the cottage smelled of cedar and mildew, and every board creaked like it was screaming under my footsteps. There were 5 rooms downstairs, a kitchen with outdated appliances, a living room with a fireplace that hadn't been used in years, a bathroom with cracked tiles, a dining room with a table still set as if expecting guests, and a small study with shelves of books whose titles had been scratched off their spines. Upstairs were 3 bedrooms and another bathroom, all with peeling wallpaper and dust thick enough to leave trails with my fingertips. The strangest part was the attic ladder, tucked into the hallway ceiling, the pull string dangling just low enough to brush the top of my head if I walked too close. I told myself I wouldn't go up there, not unless I had to, but the cottage already felt like it wanted me to. That first night, I tried to sleep in the master bedroom, but the walls creaked too often, like footsteps pacing in the room next door, and once I thought I heard whispering behind the wallpaper, soft, rhythmic, like chanting. I moved to the downstairs sofa instead, wrapping myself in a musty blanket I found in the closet, and as I lay there, I saw the hallway mirror at the base of the stairs catching just enough moonlight to show my reflection. But it wasn't just my reflection. There was something behind me, a faint outline of a woman with long hair, her face obscured, standing in the middle of the room. I sat up, heart hammering, but when I looked back, the room was empty, the air colder than before. I told myself it was exhaustion, my mind playing tricks, but deep down I knew the stories I'd heard from the locals in town weren't just superstition. They had warned me not to take the job, that the cottage had a history, that people who stayed too long either didn't come back or came back different, hollow-eyed and quiet. One old man at the gas station told me the land itself was cursed, that the ground was soft because it wasn't dirt at all, but ash, and when I asked what he meant, he just shook his head and muttered, "You'll see." That second night, the scratching started. At first, I thought it was branches against the window, but the sound was too deliberate, too slow, like fingernails dragging across glass. I froze, blanket pulled up to my chin, my breath caught in my throat, and the sound came again. Scratch, pause, scratch. Always at the same rhythm, always at the same spot. I didn't dare look, not until the sound stopped, and when I finally glanced toward the window, all I saw was fog, thick and heavy, pressed up against the glass like a living thing trying to get in. The nights that followed only grew stranger. Sometimes the mirror at the base of the stairs would show me standing there when I knew I was lying on the couch. Sometimes the books in the study would be open to pages filled with symbols I didn't recognize, though I swore I'd left them closed. Once, I found muddy footprints leading from the front door into the kitchen, though the door had been locked, and the prints stopped suddenly in the middle of the floor, as if whoever, or whatever, had been walking simply vanished. I tried to tell myself it was just an old house settling, just my imagination feeding on the isolation, but every night, as the fog rolled in and the cottage groaned like it was alive, that explanation felt thinner and thinner. The rules came to me slowly, not all at once. They weren't written down anywhere, not in the letter, not in the man's instructions, but in the way the house reacted to me, in the consequences of small mistakes I hadn't even realized I was making. For example, I learned not to leave food out overnight. The first time I did, I left half a sandwich on the kitchen counter, and when I woke up, it was gone, crumbs scattered across the floor, and the faint sound of chewing echoing in the walls. Another time, I tried whistling to pass the time, but the sound didn't echo right, didn't bounce back naturally. Instead, it sounded like something was whistling with me, just out of sync, just a breath too late, and when I stopped, the answering whistle kept going for several seconds before fading into silence. By the end of the first week, I was already regretting everything, but I was trapped. The pay was good, too good to walk away from, and the man had warned me that quitting wasn't as simple as just leaving. He'd told me, with that strange, lipless voice, once you've accepted the key, you've accepted the house. At the time, I thought he was being dramatic. Now I'm not so sure. The town itself seemed to know what was happening, or at least suspected. Whenever I went into the grocery store for supplies, people stared at me too long, whispered to each other when they thought I couldn't hear. One woman, her hands shaking as she bagged my canned beans, asked me if I'd heard the crying yet. I told her no, and she just shook her head and muttered, "You will." That night, I did. It started faint, like a child sobbing from upstairs, muffled and broken, and when I went to check, the sound moved, slipping from room to room, always, just ahead of me, until I realized it was leading me toward the attic ladder. I stood there in the hallway, staring up at that dangling string, the sobbing so close it felt like it was dripping through the ceiling, and I swear I could hear little fists pounding from the other side of the attic door. I almost pulled it open, almost climbed up, but something deep in my chest told me not to. So instead, I went back downstairs, covered the mirror with an old sheet, and sat in the kitchen until dawn, listening to the crying fade away into nothing. That's when I started writing things down. Not rules exactly, not yet, but warnings, reminders to myself about the things I'd seen and heard, about the mistakes I wouldn't repeat. But the house, or whatever it is, wasn't going to make it that easy. It wanted me to slip, to forget, to look when I shouldn't. And I knew, even then, that sooner or later, I would. The second week at Lost Creek Cottage was when the unease started to calcify into something heavier, something that clung to me even in the daylight, because by then I had stopped pretending this was just an old house making old house noises. And I had started recognizing patterns, routines almost, as if the cottage itself were alive and had its own habits that I was intruding on. And the first of those habits was how the air changed at sunset, not gradually, but all at once the way. The temperature dropped like I had stepped into a walk-in freezer, and the smell of pine and damp earth would flood through the cracks in the walls, riding on a wind that didn't match the weather outside. And sometimes I thought I could hear that wind whispering my name in a low rasp, too faint to swear by, but too clear to ignore, and it always seemed to come from the attic, always pulling at me like a lure. I started keeping lights on through the night, every lamp and bulb I could find burning yellow against the suffocating dark, but it never helped, because the shadows in that place didn't behave the way they should. they would stretch too far. Across the floor, curling around corners, and more than once I caught them moving when nothing else did, as if they belonged to someone not standing in the room. The scratching at the windows continued, sometimes soft, sometimes frantic, and I learned quickly that if I so much as glanced in the direction of the sound, the scratching would stop and be replaced by a tapping, slow and deliberate, right against the glass. And though I never let myself look, I could feel eyes on me, eyes that burned hot against the back of my skull until I was sweating despite the cold. Food went missing more often, not just small things anymore, but entire meals. And one night, I set a plate of stew on the dining room table and stepped away for only a moment. But when I returned, the bowl was still there, still steaming, yet the stew itself was gone. The spoon licked clean, and etched into the wood of the table beneath it were 3 words scratched deep into the grain: "Eat with US." I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. I just sat in the kitchen chair with a hammer in my lap, waiting for something to come down the stairs, but nothing did, at least nothing I could see. By day, the cottage seemed almost normal, like a rundown old farmhouse, but I knew better than to trust it, because even in daylight I'd catch things out of place. A chair slightly turned when I was sure I hadn't touched it, the sheet covering. The mirror pulled halfway down, muddy prints leading from the back door to the study even though the ground outside was dry. I began noticing the sounds too, not just the footsteps but other noises layered beneath them, like distant humming or the sound of teeth chattering, and sometimes, when I pressed my ear against the wall, I swore I could hear breathing, long and slow, like the house itself was inhaling. The town only fueled my paranoia, because every trip I made for supplies felt like I was stepping into a role everyone else already knew, like I was just the next in a long line of caretakers, and the way people looked at me was part pity, part terror, like they were waiting for me to start unraveling in front of them. At the diner, an old woman slid into the booth across from me without asking, her hands trembling as she set down a napkin with something scrawled across it in smeared ink. "Don't let them hear you pray." Before I could ask her what she meant, she slipped out the door and into the fog outside, leaving me with a sick feeling in my gut, because I had never told anyone that sometimes, in the deepest part of the night when the cottage pressed in too close, I found myself whispering prayers under my breath just to feel less alone. But the moment she warned me, I realized that maybe I hadn't been as alone as I thought. That night, I tested it, whispering the Lord's Prayer as softly as I could while lying on the couch. And sure enough, halfway through, the walls began to groan, a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards, and the mirror rattled against the wall until I stopped. And then everything fell back into silence, so heavy it felt like being buried alive. That was when I started understanding that there were unspoken rules here, rules the locals knew but wouldn't or couldn't say out loud, rules I would only learn the hard way, and every mistake carried a price. The crying from the attic returned, sometimes joined by what sounded like laughter, high-pitched and wrong, like a child pretending to be happy. And one night, I woke to find the attic string swaying back and forth though no window was open, and when I reached up to still it, I felt a hand close over mine, small, cold, bony, and I yanked back so fast I stumbled against the wall, heart hammering. But when I looked again, the string was still. I didn't sleep after that, not really, just drifted in and out with one eye open, listening to the sounds of things moving just beyond my vision, waiting for me to slip. Days bled together, and I stopped keeping track of the calendar, but I know it was around the 3rd week when I made my worst mistake yet. I had been in the study, flipping through one of the old books even though I knew better, the letters carved strange and jagged, some of them seeming to crawl across the page if I stared too long, and I whispered one of the words out loud, just curious, just careless. The instant the word left my lips, the air in the room shifted, heavy and sharp, and all the lights flickered out at once, plunging me into a darkness that felt thick as tar. In that blackness, I heard it, breathing, not from the walls this time, but from right beside me, so close I could feel the air stir against my ear, and then a voice whispered back the same word I had spoken, mimicking me in a tone that was both mine and not mine, layered and distorted. I bolted from the study, slammed the door, and didn't go back in for days. But even after that, I kept hearing echoes of that word in the hallways, soft and taunting, as though something had heard me. call, and was waiting for me to finish. That was when the dreams started, if they were dreams at all. Visions where I wandered the cottage and found doors that didn't exist in waking life. Doors that opened into endless forests of black trees or stairways that spiraled down into the earth, lined with faces pressed into the stone, whispering through cracked lips. I'd wake drenched in sweat, sometimes with dirt under my fingernails, once with pine needles in my sheets, and I began to dread sleep as much as I dreaded the waking hours. The cottage was wearing me down, eroding me little by little, and I knew I couldn't keep this up much longer without losing myself completely. One night, though, I found something that gave me both hope and dread in equal measure. Hidden beneath the floorboard in the master bedroom was a small, leather-bound journal, brittle with age, its pages filled with cramped handwriting. The entries were dated decades ago, written by someone who called himself Caretaker, just like me, and the things he described matched what I had been living through. The scratching, the crying, the mirror, the whispers, but scattered. Between the ramblings were fragments of order, little notes like, never whistle after dark, don't answer when they knock, don't speak their names. Rules, half-formed, incomplete, but rules all the same. It was proof that I wasn't the first, and that maybe, just maybe, there was a way to survive if I could learn them all before it was too late. But as I read, I realized something even worse. The final pages ended abruptly, the writing jagged, smeared, and the last legible line chilled me to my core. If you find this journal, it means I failed. Don't make the same mistakes. The house doesn't forgive. After that, the cottage didn't feel like just a place anymore. It felt like an opponent, watching, waiting, adapting to me. Every night became a test, every sound a trap, every choice a gamble. And I began to understand that the rules weren't arbitrary. They were the only thing keeping the house from swallowing me whole. By the time the third week bled into the fourth, the cottage had stopped being a place I stayed in and started feeling like a set of jaws around me, waiting to clamp shut, and the only thing keeping them open were the fragments of rules I was slowly piecing together from the journal I'd found, from my own mistakes, and from the warnings of strangers who seemed too afraid to spell things out directly. And so, with a trembling hand and the constant feeling of being watched, I started to write them down in a notebook of my own, carefully numbering them because I knew if I didn't treat them like law, I'd slip, and if I slipped, I wouldn't come back. The first one came easily, because I had already paid the price for breaking it. Rule 1. Never leave food out overnight. I had seen what happened when I did, and I couldn't shake the image of crumbs scattered like bait or the sound of chewing that echoed inside the walls as if something had been crawling through them, gnawing happily. And though I never saw the thing itself, the next morning I found small teeth marks carved into the edge of the countertop, too sharp to be human, too deliberate to be animal. I wrote it down in thick, angry letters. Then came the warnings about sound, the ones I had already tested without meaning to. Rule 2. Never whistle after dark. That one nearly broke me, because the sound of the answering whistle had been almost playful, like a child trying to mimic an adult. But there was something sinister in the way it always lagged just behind me, as though it wanted to prove it could follow me anywhere, echoing into my bones until I felt I wasn't whistling alone, but calling something closer with every note. And tied to that, I added Rule 3. Never pray where they can hear. The journal had hinted at it, and the old woman at the diner had all but screamed it in her trembling scrawl, and I had proven it true when the walls themselves shook as though my whispered words were an insult, as though faith was like fire in a place that didn't want light. My hand was shaking as I wrote those down, because these weren't just rules, they were landmines, and the cottage was daring me to step wrong. The attic string came next, because by then it had become more than just a curiosity. It had become a test I was failing night after night. Rule 4. Never pull the attic string, no matter what you hear. That one felt carved into me as much as into the page, because I couldn't forget the sensation of that small, bony hand closing over mine in the dark, or the sound of muffled fists pounding just inches above my head, begging me to let something out. Something that could mimic a child's cry well enough to almost trick me. Then there was the mirror, always the mirror, reflecting things that weren't there, showing me standing when I wasn't, or revealing the woman with the long hair, who hovered just behind my shoulder. Rule 5. Always keep the hallway mirror covered after sundown. I had broken that one once by accident, when the sheet had slipped during the night, and I woke to find myself staring at my own reflection standing in the middle of the room while I lay frozen on the couch, and for a moment, I didn't know which version was real. The footprints and the knocking came next, the intrusions I couldn't explain, but which the journal confirmed with scrawled desperation. Rule 6. If you hear knocking, never answer. That one was simple, terrifyingly simple, because the journal described a caretaker who had answered once, who had opened the door to find no one there, and yet the footprints that followed him into the cottage had led straight to his bed and stopped there. I remembered the muddy prints I had found before, the ones that vanished in the kitchen, and I pressed my pen so hard into the paper the page tore. And with it, Rule 7. Never follow the footprints, no matter where they lead. Because the journal had described them leading into places they shouldn't, into walls, into locked doors, into corners that should have been empty, and always ending abruptly, as though they didn't just vanish but were waiting, holding still, until you leaned too close. By then, the rules were forming a rhythm, an order, but they weren't enough, because the nights were still alive with things I couldn't name, and the dreams were dragging me further from sanity. That's when I remembered the voices, the whispers that echoed back when I spoke certain words, the mimicry that repeated me in tones just wrong enough to twist my stomach. Rule 8. Never speak their words aloud. The journal had been filled with strange symbols, jagged letters that didn't belong to any language I knew, and when I had whispered one, I had felt the weight of something answering, so I underlined that. Rule twice, warning myself never to give them a voice, because the moment I did, I wasn't speaking alone. The fog was harder to pin down, harder to explain, but it pressed against the windows every night, thick as wool, suffocating the glass, and the scratching always came with it. I wrote it down anyway, because my gut told me it mattered. Rule 9. Never look directly into the fog. That one was almost instinct, because I knew if I stared too long, something would be staring back, something that wanted me to acknowledge it, and once I did, I'd be claimed. And then there was the matter of time, the sense that the hours between midnight and 3 weren't just hours, but something else, a window when the house itself felt strongest, when every sound, every shadow, every creak of the board swelled into something unbearable. The journal hinted at it too, in shaky letters. The hours belonged to them. So I added Rule 10. Between midnight and 3, stay in one room, don't wander. I remembered the night I had chased the crying child from room to room until it led me to the attic, and I realized that it had been a test, a trap I had almost walked straight into. I stopped writing then, staring at the list with a mixture of relief and dread, because part of me believed that having these rules written down gave me a fighting chance, a set of boundaries I could cling to, but another part of me knew that the house wanted me to have them, that it wanted me to play along, because a game isn't fun unless you know the rules. Still, I couldn't help myself. I read them out loud under my breath, committing them to memory, whispering like a mantra, in the dim glow of a lamp. And when I finished, the cottage went silent, utterly silent, so much so that I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then, from the attic above me, came 3 slow knocks, deliberate, patient, like applause. I froze, my breath stuck in my throat, and the string above swayed gently back and forth as if someone were laughing, taunting me. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat at the table with the journal and my notebook spread open, staring at the rules like they were, both my salvation and my curse. The man who had given me the keys had never mentioned any of this. The townsfolk only offered riddles and warnings, and now I was left with a list that felt incomplete, unfinished. Because even as I wrote them, even as I obeyed them, there were still things I couldn't explain. The laughter that sometimes followed me into my dreams, the dirt under my nails when I hadn't gone outside, the feeling of waking up in a room I didn't remember entering. There were still gaps in the pattern, still rules I hadn't discovered, and the cottage wasn't going to stop testing me until I broke. Somewhere, deep down, I knew the rules weren't just to protect me from the house. They were to protect the house from me, or maybe to protect something far worse, locked away within its bones. And the longer I stayed, the more certain I became that the rules weren't written for survival, not really. They were written for containment. The days and nights at the Black Lantern had already blended together into a fever dream rhythm, but by the time of my life there began, the rules were no longer abstract instructions scribbled on yellowing paper. They were etched into my bones, burned into my nerves, rattling like chains in my skull, and I had come to understand with a nauseating certainty that they weren't just rules, they were restraints. Thin but unbreakable barriers keeping the chaos just barely contained behind the fragile skin of reality. And every hour I stayed at that store, those restraints felt like they were straining, fraying, weakening under a pressure I couldn't see but could feel in my marrow. And it all started that night when I showed up for the shift, expecting the familiar fluorescent buzz and the smell of stale dust and coffee, only to find the front door already cracked open as if the store had been expecting me. Breathing softly, sighing through the gap like a lung too large for its ribcage. And when I stepped inside, I immediately noticed something was off. The aisles weren't where they were supposed to be. The racks of canned goods and rotting chips had shifted, twisted in their arrangement, forming a layout more like a maze than a store. The lights hummed lower, dimmer, casting pools of yellow instead of bright clarity, and I froze at the realization that the Black Lantern was rearranging itself again. Like a beast stretching in its sleep, testing the cage of rules it was locked inside, and the paper list of instructions crinkled in my pocket like a heartbeat, whispering against my thigh as if urging me to remember every single one, because tonight they mattered more than ever. And that's when I saw it. Rule number 7, the one I'd never truly encountered before, flickered at the edge of my vision on the paper even though I hadn't taken it out, glowing faintly as though the ink itself had begun to bleed through fabric and skin. If you see the aisles move, do not follow the new path. Keep your eyes forward and walk only where you already know. My mouth went dry because the store had never dared reveal its shifting bones so openly before, and yet there I was, standing at the entrance of a labyrinth that hadn't been there the night before, with shelves groaning as they slid across the linoleum, boxes toppling off as if in protest, and somewhere in the distance, deeper than the store should have gone, something shuffled, dragging its feet slowly like a man carrying chains, and my instincts screamed to bolt, to turn around, to abandon this cursed job right there. But the second I reached for the door behind me, it shut with a slam so loud it rattled the candy racks, and I knew with the kind of dread that curdles your stomach into stone that the Black Lantern wasn't going to let me leave. Not tonight. Not until I had walked the maze it had built for me. Not until I had endured whatever test it had carved out of its guts. And so I clutched the list in my pocket, forced my legs forward, and began the long walk into the rearranged aisles, counting my steps like a man measuring his march to the gallows, the buzzing lights overhead flickering in odd intervals, sometimes in sync with my breathing, sometimes in sync with something else entirely, something watching me just out of sight. And as I turned the first corner, I swore I glimpsed shadows darting at the end of the aisle. Too tall, too thin, bending at joints no human skeleton allowed, and yet always gone when I blinked, until I started to realize they weren't avoiding me. They were guiding me deeper, herding me like a sheep through a twisting path of shifting shelves, and the rule about never following new paths screamed louder in my skull. Yet every old, familiar row I tried to step into sealed itself shut behind falling boxes, collapsing racks, closing the way until I had no choice but to walk forward into the geometry of madness the store had designed. And with each step, the hum of the refrigeration units grew more distorted, like voices pressed through a wall, chanting words I couldn't make out but felt deep in my bones, like prayers to something that didn't believe in mercy. And I don't know how long I walked, time collapsing in on itself, the clock on my phone frozen at 3:13 a.m. The witching hour stretched into an eternity, and it wasn't until I turned a corner and saw the lantern, that cursed Black Lantern, the one carved into the name of the store itself, the one no rule had ever mentioned but every instinct told me was the source of it all, standing on a pedestal made of stacked boxes, at the center of the rearranged aisles. Its glass dark but pulsing faintly with something like a heartbeat, that I knew why the store had shifted, why it had trapped me tonight. It wanted me to see it, it wanted me to touch it, it wanted me to carry its flame, and every fiber of me screamed that if I did, if I obeyed whatever impulse was coiling around my mind, I wouldn't be me anymore. I'd be another husk walking these aisles forever. Like the shadows I'd glimpsed, thin and wrong, doomed to herd the next unlucky soul deeper, and yet the rules burned in my hand. One last line glowing brighter than the rest now, as if the paper itself was alive. If the lantern calls to you, never answer. Never light it. Never carry it. But the shadows had closed in, their limbs scraping against the metal racks, their teeth glinting faintly in the low light, whispering my name now in voices that sounded like drowned throats, and I knew with the clarity of a condemned man that this was the trial the store had been saving for me all along. That of my survival wasn't about keeping the lights on or watching the door or feeding the things outside. It was about refusing the heart of the black lantern itself. And as I stood trembling before that pulsing dark glass, I realized the rules weren't chains keeping me safe. They were chains keeping the lantern caged. And tonight those chains were snapping, one by one, echoing like breaking bones in the dark aisles of a store that had never been a store at all. The truth is, I never should have made it this far. But by the time I found myself on the edge of that ruined chapel at the heart of the asylum's grounds, I had already broken so many of the rules, seen so many faces that were never human, and heard my own name whispered from mouths that had no flesh. That turning back felt like the kind of cowardice that would leave me haunted forever. And so I stepped into the broken nave where moonlight bled through shattered stained glass windows and painted the floor in shifting red and blue shards. And the stench of mildew and rot clung to the damp air, and my boots sank slightly into the warped wood as though the chapel itself was trying to hold me, dragging me down into its belly. And as the door creaked shut behind me with the soft inevitability of a coffin lid, I knew I was alone yet surrounded, for the pews seemed to breathe. And in the flicker of my flashlight beam, I swore the crooked figures carved into the pulpit were leaning forward, straining to listen, their eyes gouged deep into the wood but glimmering as though wet. And then came the voices, not loud, not screaming, but whispering prayers in Latin or something far older, prayers that sounded like chains dragging across stone. And I gripped the pages of the rulebook I'd shoved into my pocket, the one now tattered, smudged with blood, and nearly illegible. And I remembered rule number 12 that I had nearly laughed at when I first read it in the security office weeks ago. If you hear the congregation singing, cover your ears, bow your head, and do not join in no matter what the hymn promises. And of course, as if summoned by my recognition of those words, the whispers merged into a hollow, trembling chant, voices rising from the walls, from beneath the floorboards, from within my own throat, a hymn that promised rest, escape, an end to the endless terror if only I joined. And my knees shook, my head throbbed with pressure, but I pressed my palms hard to my ears and staggered down the center aisle, each step heavier than the last, as though invisible hands clutched my ankles, dragging, begging, and I passed pew after pew where faceless figures sat, their heads bowed, their torsos rising and falling with the rhythm of the chant, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, impossible shadows in a place that had been abandoned for decades, and yet they swayed, whispering the song. And though I refused to look directly at them, the corners of my eyes saw the shifting, the stretching of their limbs, as though they were stitched together from the memories of all who had ever entered this place and lost themselves. And the air thickened, sulfur and mold pressing into my lungs until I could barely breathe, and yet I pushed forward because I knew at the altar there would be something. An answer, a key, maybe the final truth that had been clawing its way toward me through every night of this nightmare. And when I finally reached it, when I placed my trembling hands on the cracked stone and looked down, I saw not the holy book I had expected, not relics, not even bones, but a mirror, a black glass pane sunk into the altar's top, reflecting not me, but a version of myself. I couldn't accept, gaunt, hollow-eyed, with a grin carved too wide across my face. And behind that reflection, the congregation wasn't seated anymore. They were all standing, every faceless thing turned toward me, their heads tilting in unnatural unison. And though I could not see their mouths, I knew they were smiling, because the hymn swelled, filling the chapel, filling me, and I realized my lips were moving, mouthing the words despite my hands still clamped to my ears. And that was when the rulebook ignited in my pocket, heat spreading across my thigh, and I ripped it out, flames already consuming the pages. Yet I couldn't drop it. Something in me demanded I hold on, that maybe the fire would cleanse, would end this. And when the last page shriveled in my palm, the reflection in the mirror leaned closer, lips curling to whisper a word I couldn't hear but felt, a word that filled me with ice and recognition. And then the entire chapel shook as if the foundation cracked, pews splintering, the faceless congregation collapsing like puppets with cut strings. And yet the hymn continued though. No one sang it, rattling my bones, shaking the world. And I realized too late that the rule book wasn't a guide. It was a contract, and in burning it I hadn't freed myself. I had broken the last seal, and the thing that had waited beneath the asylum, beneath the earth itself, began to rise. Its presence seeping up through the stone floor in tendrils of shadow that smelled of rust and grave soil. And I stumbled back, screaming soundlessly, because even before it took form, before it revealed its true face, I knew it had always been me, that every step I had taken, every door I had opened, every rule I had bent, was only drawing me closer to this moment, this unholy merging. And as the chapel roof caved in, as the stained glass shattered inward in a rain of bloody shards, the thing from the mirror reached for me. And though I turned to run, though I fought to claw my way out into the night, the shadows were faster, wrapping around my throat like a prayer no one survives. And in that instant of suffocating darkness, I realized there had never been an escape, only the illusion of choice. Only the cruel gravity of inevitability pulling me toward the final chapter that had been written the night I first signed my name on that employment contract. The clock above the Black Lantern store read 11:55 p.m. when I returned for what I already knew in my bones would be the last time. The air outside unusually still, as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable unraveling of everything tethered loosely together by the so-called rules that had once given me a fragile illusion of control. The neon sign buzzed faintly overhead, flickering like a dying heartbeat, and as I stepped across the threshold, I felt the entire building tremble beneath my weight, groaning like an old ship bracing for the storm, its walls no longer wood and plaster but something closer to sinew and bone, pulsing faintly as if the structure itself had awakened into something alive, resentful, and hungry. The rules pinned to the counter were different tonight. Their letters had rearranged themselves, the ink blacker than void, spelling out things I didn't understand but could feel deep in my marrow, the kind of language that bypasses the eyes and hooks directly into the nerves. Words like return, acceptance, unraveling bled into my head and echoed until I thought my skull would split. Yet I could not look away, because I knew the store was no longer a place but a mouth, a threshold, and I had been circling its gullet for nights upon nights, only to finally be swallowed whole. The shelves groaned as if under immense weight, items shifting, muttering, whispering to each other in voices I couldn't place, while the soda machine hissed like a leaking lung, spewing foam that writhed like worms onto the floor. I stepped past it, toward the stockroom, where I felt the pull intensify like the grip of a tide pulling me out to sea. Every instinct screaming that I should run, that I should scream, that I should claw at the walls until my fingernails bled. But I didn't, because somewhere deep inside, beyond fear, beyond exhaustion, I understood the terrible truth. The rules had never been there to protect me. They were breadcrumbs, guiding me deeper into the maze, leading me straight toward the thing, waiting at its heart. Midnight struck with a silence so thick it felt like cotton stuffed in my ears, the world outside gone utterly still, and then the door to the freezer swung open on its own, exhaling a cold so sharp it sliced across my skin like a blade, carrying with it a stench of rot and ozone. Inside, there was no food, no boxes, no shelves, only a tunnel of frost-rimmed flesh descending into infinite darkness, its walls lined with pulsating veins and twitching hands pressing outward, as though a thousand forgotten souls clawed at the barrier between their prison and this reality. My legs carried me forward despite every nerve sparking rebellion, because the rules had been rewritten not in ink but in me, carved into my bones, etched into the synapses of my brain, and I realized then that the store hadn't chosen me for survival. It had chosen me for consumption, for completion, for the closing of its loop. As I descended, the whispers became screams, the hands breaking free from the walls to grab at my clothes, my hair, my flesh, pulling, tearing, yet never enough to end me, only enough to shepherd me further into the abyss. Faces formed in the frost, mouths opening in silent wails, eyes rolling toward me with recognition, and I saw the previous clerks, every soul who had stood behind that counter, every fool who thought they could outsmart the list of rules there. Faces warped into eternal agony, their voices a choir of despair urging me to turn back even though they knew it was far, far too late. At the end of the tunnel, a chamber opened, vast, cathedral-like, its ceiling stretching beyond sight, ribs arched high like the supports of some obscene sanctuary. In the center was the heart of it all, the black lantern itself, not a lamp, not a beacon, but a colossal organ of black glass and burning marrow, its light not illumination but infection, seeping into everything, rewriting reality with every flicker. The air thickened, my chest seizing, my vision fracturing into splinters, and then it spoke, not in words but in the collapse of silence, a message that reverberated through me with the finality of a locked coffin. You were always mine. My body convulsed, veins bulging with shadows as my skin split to reveal the rules not written but branded across me. Every violation, every hesitation, every broken promise fueling the lantern's hunger, and I fell to my knees, not out of reverence, but inevitability, because you cannot rebel against gravity, you cannot argue with the tide, and you cannot survive the black lantern once you've been chosen. The last thing I remember before the light engulfed me was seeing my reflection in its obsidian surface, not as myself, but as something hollow, faceless, stretched thin into nothing, my body already being rewritten into the store's architecture. My scream lost in the chorus of countless others who came before me, the lantern feeding, growing, preparing to reach further out into the world beyond its rotten walls. And now, if you're hearing this, if the story found you, understand that the rules are already inside you, etched invisibly across your life, waiting to activate the moment you step into the wrong place at the wrong time. The Black Lantern hungers endlessly, it whispers ceaselessly, and it does not forgive, it does not relent, it only consumes. I was never a clerk. I was never an employee. I was a sacrifice dressed in the illusion of choice, a moth circling the flame until its wings caught fire. And when your turn comes, when you find yourself standing beneath that flickering neon sign, staring at the rules on the counter that seem so simple, so absurd, remember this. You were warned, but warning means nothing. The end is inevitable. The store always wins.